3 weeks after my husband's funeral, I found a baby seat in his car, but we never had children, and I thought we never could. What I discovered next would shatter everything I believed about my marriage, my family, and myself, but it would also lead me to uncover a strength I never knew I possessed, and a truth that would change not just my life, but the lives of others who had been living in the shadows of secrets for far too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The metal key felt cold against my palm as I stood in the parking garage beneath our downtown apartment building, staring at David's silver Accord. 3 weeks had passed since the accident that claimed my husband's life, 3 weeks since I had become a widow at 34, and this was the first time I could bring myself to approach his car. The insurance company had been patient, but their patience was wearing thin. The vehicle needed to be cleared out and either sold or transferred to my name. Our financial advisor had been equally gentle but persistent about settling David's affairs. The life insurance money sat untouched in a checking account while I struggled to make decisions about furniture, clothing, and the accumulated possessions of a 7-year marriage that had ended in a split second on Highway 285. I pressed the unlock button and heard the familiar chirp that David used to joke sounded like a cheerful goodbye every morning when he left for his job at the engineering firm. The sound now felt like a cruel mockery of permanence, a technological ghost that would outlive the man who had programmed it. The driver's seat still held the impression of his body, the steering wheel positioned exactly where his hands had adjusted it, the rearview mirror angled to accommodate his height. His sunglasses lay folded in the center console beside a half-empty pack of gum and the Bluetooth earpiece he used for conference calls during his commute. I had prepared myself for this emotional assault. What I had not prepared for was what I discovered when I opened the rear door to check for any items that might have rolled under the seats. A car seat. A baby car seat, properly installed with the precision David brought to all his engineering projects, secured with latches and safety straps, in a way that demonstrated both knowledge and practice. The seat showed signs of use, with crumb remnants in the fabric crevices and a small stuffed giraffe tucked into the side pocket. My hands began trembling as I stared at this impossible object. David and I had never had children. We had tried for the first 3 years of our marriage before medical tests revealed that conception would be unlikely without significant intervention. The fertility treatments had been expensive, emotionally devastating, and ultimately unsuccessful. After 18 months of procedures, medications, and crushing disappointments, we had agreed to stop trying and focus on building a fulfilling life together as a couple. That decision had been mutual, reached through careful discussions and shared grief over dreams we would need to release. David had been supportive throughout the process, holding me through the hormonal storms caused by fertility drugs, accompanying me to every appointment, and never expressing disappointment when treatments failed. When we finally decided to stop, he had assured me that our marriage was complete without children, that he wanted no life other than the one we were building together. Yet here was evidence that suggested a different reality entirely. I photographed the car seat with my phone, capturing the model number and installation details with the same methodical approach David would have used. My mind raced through possible explanations. Perhaps he had offered to help a colleague transport their child. Perhaps the seat belonged to his brother Marcus, who had 2 young children and might have borrowed the car. Perhaps David had purchased it for his sister Caroline, who lived in Seattle and was expecting her first baby. Each explanation felt forced, failing to account for the seat's permanent installation and obvious regular use. This was not a temporary accommodation or a favor for family members. This car seat had been used regularly by someone who knew the vehicle well enough to install it properly, and by a child who had spent enough time in it to leave behind snack remnants and a comfort toy. I called Marcus immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. His surprise sounded genuine, and he confirmed that he had never borrowed David's car for child transportation. His own children used properly installed seats in his minivan, and he would never have moved them to another vehicle without informing me. Caroline's response was equally puzzling. She was indeed expecting, but not until the following spring, and she had not asked David to purchase baby equipment. More importantly, she lived 2,000 miles away and had not visited in over 6 months. The logical explanations were evaporating, leaving me with possibilities I was not prepared to consider. I returned to the car and began a more thorough search, looking for additional evidence that might explain this mystery. The glove compartment contained the usual documents: registration, insurance papers, maintenance records, along with a manila envelope I did not recognize. Inside were receipts for purchases I had never seen: infant formula, disposable diapers, baby food, children's acetaminophen. The dates spanned the previous 8 months, with purchases made at various pharmacies and grocery stores across the city. The receipts created a timeline that corresponded with no known events in our shared life. During those same 8 months, David and I had maintained our usual routines. He went to work each morning, returned home each evening, and spent weekends on household projects or social activities we enjoyed together. We had taken a vacation to Colorado, celebrated our anniversary with dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date, and hosted Thanksgiving dinner for both our families. At no point during those months had David exhibited behavior that suggested he was caring for an infant or maintaining relationships that required him to purchase baby supplies. Yet the evidence was undeniable. These were not random purchases or gifts for others. The quantities and frequencies suggested ongoing responsibility for a child's daily needs. I sat in the passenger seat where I had spent hundreds of hours during our marriage, accompanying David on weekend trips to visit family, vacation drives through mountain highways, and routine errands around the city. The familiarity of the space, the way the seat adjusted to accommodate my shorter legs, the cup holder where I always placed my coffee, the armrest we had negotiated as our shared boundary, made the presence of the car seat feel like a violation of everything I understood about our shared life. My phone buzzed with a text message from David's mother, asking whether I needed help clearing out his belongings. Janet Walker had been supportive throughout the 3 weeks since the accident, bringing meals, handling phone calls from David's colleagues, and helping me navigate the bureaucratic requirements that follow sudden death. She had been my ally in grief, understanding my need for time to process the loss before making major decisions about our shared possessions. But now I wondered what else she might know about David's life that I had not been aware of. Had she known about the car seat? Had she met a child I knew nothing about? Had my husband been living a double life that everyone understood except his wife? I decided not to mention the discovery to Janet immediately. Instead, I would conduct my own investigation, searching for explanations that might preserve the marriage I thought I had known while acknowledging the evidence that suggested otherwise. The next several hours were spent in David's home office, searching through files, computer records, and personal papers for any reference to children or childcare responsibilities. His desk contained the usual professional materials: project reports, correspondence with clients, technical drawings for building systems he had designed. His computer required a password I did not know, another small revelation about the boundaries that had existed in our marriage, without my conscious awareness. I had never needed access to David's computer during our marriage. We had maintained separate email accounts and shared household information through verbal communication. His work was confidential, involving proprietary building designs and client information that I had no reason to access. Our trust had been built on respect for each other's professional boundaries, rather than complete transparency about every aspect of our daily activities. Now that trust felt naive rather than mature, a willful blindness that had allowed secrets to flourish in the spaces I had chosen not to examine. The financial records I could access revealed no unusual expenditures or payments that might indicate child support or daycare costs. David's bank statements showed regular patterns of spending that corresponded with our shared lifestyle: mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery purchases, restaurant charges, and occasional larger expenses for home improvements or vacations. But the baby supply receipts had been paid with cash, leaving no electronic trail in our joint accounts. This suggested deliberate concealment, a systematic effort to hide these purchases from someone who might have access to credit card statements or banking records. That someone was obviously me. As evening approached, I returned to the car to continue my search. The trunk contained David's emergency kit, jumper cables, and a small toolbox he used for minor automotive repairs. But tucked beneath the spare tire, I found a diaper bag. It was well used, with the worn fabric and stained interior that indicated regular service rather than occasional use. Inside were the remnants of someone's daily routine: empty formula bottles, unused diapers in size 3, a package of wet wipes, and a small outfit in 18-month sizing. There was also a handwritten note tucked into the bag's front pocket, folded and refolded as if it had been read multiple times. The note was written in David's careful engineer's handwriting: Emma's favorite songs, Twinkle Twinkle, You Are My Sunshine, Row, Row, Row Your Boat. She likes to be sung to during car rides. Nap time is usually around 1 p.m. She may cry when you first put her in the car seat, but she settles down once the car starts moving. Emma. The child had a name, preferences, and routines that David knew intimately enough to document for someone else's reference. This was not a casual relationship or an occasional favor. This was ongoing, detailed involvement in a child's daily care. I photographed the note and returned it to the diaper bag, my hands shaking with anger, confusion, and grief that had suddenly become much more complex. I was no longer mourning just the loss of my husband, but the discovery that the man I had loved and trusted had been living portions of his life completely separate from our marriage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive home through evening traffic felt surreal, as if I were moving through a world that looked familiar but operated according to rules I no longer understood. Other drivers were returning home to their families, carrying their own secrets and complications, while I traveled toward an apartment that had been transformed from a shared sanctuary into a place where I would confront the possibility that my entire adult life had been built on incomplete information. David's death had already shattered my assumptions about the future we had been planning together. Now the discovery of Emma's existence was shattering my understanding of the past we had actually lived. But as I parked in our building's garage and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, I realized that my shock was beginning to transform into something more powerful: determination. I needed to understand who Emma was, how she had become part of David's life, and what responsibilities or relationships his death had left unresolved. For the first time since the accident, I had a purpose that extended beyond grief and legal obligations. I had a mystery that demanded investigation and possibly a child who needed protection or support that David's death had suddenly eliminated. I did not yet know that this discovery would lead me to uncover not just David's secrets, but my own capacity for strength, advocacy, and love that I had never been required to demonstrate. I did not know that Emma would become the catalyst for the most important work of my life, or that David's hidden truth would ultimately reveal my own hidden potential. But as I unlocked the door to our apartment and stepped into the space that would never again feel like the home I had known, I understood that my real life was just beginning. Sleep eluded me that night as I lay in the bed David and I had shared for 7 years, staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed every conversation, every unexplained absence, every moment that might have contained clues about Emma's existence. The digital clock beside his empty pillow marked the hours in cruel precision: 2:17 a.m., 3:42 a.m., 4:55 a.m., each minute bringing me closer to a dawn that would demand decisions I was not prepared to make. At some point during those dark hours, I realized that my grief had transformed into something more complex and demanding. I was no longer simply mourning the loss of my husband, but confronting the possibility that the man I had loved completely had never existed in the form I had believed. Every shared memory was now subject to re-examination, every tender moment potentially shadowed by relationships and responsibilities he had chosen to conceal. The morning brought practical necessities that temporarily distracted from existential questions. I needed to return to my position at the nonprofit where I managed donor relations, having exhausted the bereavement leave that had carried me through David's funeral and the immediate aftermath of his death. My supervisor, Margaret Chen, had been understanding about my need for flexibility during this period, but organizational responsibilities could not be suspended indefinitely while I processed personal revelations. The Riverside Community Foundation occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, its open floor plan and exposed brick walls, designed to communicate accessibility and innovation. I had worked there for 4 years, developing fundraising strategies, and maintaining relationships with individual donors and corporate sponsors who supported our housing and social services programs. The work provided intellectual satisfaction and aligned with values David and I had shared about community responsibility and social justice. But as I settled at my desk and reviewed the donor contact lists that required attention, I found myself wondering whether David's commitment to our shared values had extended to his relationship with Emma, or whether his support for programs serving vulnerable families had been complicated by secrets he had been unwilling to share with his wife. My colleague Jennifer Martinez approached with the cautious expression people adopt when addressing someone whose personal circumstances have recently become tragic and potentially unstable. Jennifer and I had developed a professional friendship built on mutual respect and occasional social interaction. But she had maintained appropriate boundaries during my bereavement period, offering support without intrusion. "How are you managing your return to work?" she asked, settling into the chair beside my desk with coffee and the careful attention of someone prepared to listen, but uncertain about the appropriate depth of inquiry. I considered sharing the previous day's discoveries, but realized that discussing David's potential infidelity and secret child with a colleague would transform personal crisis into workplace gossip. Jennifer's concern was genuine, but her professional obligations included maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal sympathy and organizational productivity. "Each day brings new challenges," I replied, choosing language that acknowledged difficulty without revealing specifics that might require her to provide counseling beyond her capabilities or comfort level. Jennifer nodded with the understanding of someone who had never experienced sudden widowhood, but possessed sufficient emotional intelligence to recognize that platitudes would provide no meaningful comfort. "The donor appreciation event is scheduled for next month," she continued, transitioning to work-related matters with visible relief. "We will need to finalize catering arrangements and confirm attendance with major sponsors. Should I handle those details while you focus on other priorities?" The event represented months of preparation designed to strengthen relationships with funders who supported our affordable housing and family services programs. Under normal circumstances, I would have insisted on maintaining direct involvement in every aspect of the planning process. But these were not normal circumstances, and I was beginning to understand that my definition of normal had been based on incomplete information about the life I had been living. "I appreciate the offer, but I would prefer to maintain my usual responsibilities," I replied, recognizing that work structure might provide stability while other aspects of my life underwent examination and potential reconstruction. The morning passed in routine tasks that demanded attention without requiring emotional investment. I updated donor records, reviewed grant applications, and coordinated with program managers about services that supported families facing housing instability and economic hardship. The work felt both familiar and strange, as if I were performing activities that belonged to a previous version of myself who had possessed certainty about her marriage and her husband's character. During lunch break, I drove to the address listed on one of the baby supply receipts I had discovered in David's car. The pharmacy was located in a neighborhood I rarely visited, approximately 15 minutes from our apartment in a direction opposite from David's workplace. The location suggested deliberate choice rather than convenience, a place where he was unlikely to encounter people who knew us as a couple. The pharmacist who had processed several of the transactions was a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who recognized David's photograph with the immediate familiarity of someone who had served a regular customer. Her expression shifted to concern when I explained that David had died in an accident, and I was attempting to understand purchases he had made during the previous months. "Mr. Walker was one of our most reliable customers," she said, consulting computer records that documented his purchase history. "He came in every 2 weeks for formula and diapers, always knew exactly what he needed, never seemed rushed or uncertain about the products." The description reinforced my growing understanding that David's involvement with Emma had been systematic and ongoing, rather than occasional or reluctant. Patricia's records showed purchases dating back 10 months, suggesting that his relationship with this child had begun during a period when our marriage had seemed particularly stable and content. "Did he ever mention the child these supplies were for?" I asked, hoping for information that might clarify Emma's identity or David's relationship to her. Patricia shook her head with the practiced discretion of someone trained to respect customer privacy. "He seemed very knowledgeable about what he needed, but he did not discuss personal details. He was always polite and efficient, paid in cash, and appeared to be someone who took his responsibilities seriously. I thanked Patricia for her time and returned to my car with confirmation that David's secret had been sustained through deliberate planning rather than spontaneous circumstances. His behavior at the pharmacy had been that of a committed caregiver who understood his obligations and fulfilled them consistently over an extended period. The afternoon brought a phone call that would deepen the mystery while providing the first potential lead toward resolution. David's insurance agent, Robert Kim, contacted me regarding paperwork that required completion before his life insurance claim could be processed. During our conversation, Robert mentioned that David had recently inquired about adding a dependent to his policy, though no formal application had been submitted before his death. He asked about the requirements for insuring a child who was not legally his biological offspring, Robert explained. The conversation occurred approximately 6 weeks before the accident. He said he wanted to understand his options but was not ready to make immediate changes to his coverage. The timing corresponded with David's increased frequency of baby supply purchases, suggesting that his relationship with Emma had been evolving toward greater formality and legal recognition. Perhaps he had been considering adoption, or had discovered he was Emma's biological father through circumstances that required time to address appropriately. Did he provide any details about the child's situation or his relationship to her? I asked, though I recognized that professional confidentiality might limit Robert's ability to share specific information. He mentioned that the child's mother was facing health challenges that might affect her ability to provide care, Robert replied. He wanted to ensure that financial protection would be available if he became responsible for the child's welfare. The conversation was preliminary, but his concern seemed genuine and urgent. This information suggested that David's involvement with Emma might have been motivated by necessity rather than deception, that he might have been responding to a crisis that required immediate assistance while he determined how to integrate this responsibility into our marriage. Perhaps he had been protecting both Emma and me by maintaining separation until he could develop a plan that addressed everyone's needs appropriately. But this interpretation required me to accept that David would have made major life decisions without consulting his wife, that he would have assumed responsibility for a child's welfare without discussing the implications with the person who would be most affected by such commitments. Even if his motivations had been protective rather than deceptive, his approach represented a fundamental breach of the partnership we had built together. I spent the remainder of the afternoon researching legal procedures for locating children who might have been affected by a guardian's sudden death. The process required specific information I did not possess, including Emma's full name, her mother's identity, and documentation of David's legal relationship to her care. The search revealed how little I actually knew about the man I had been married to for 7 years. I could describe his professional expertise, his favorite restaurants, his political opinions, and his preferences for vacation destinations. I could predict his reactions to movies, his choices in clothing, and his responses to social situations we encountered together. But I had no knowledge of relationships or responsibilities that had occupied significant portions of his time and emotional energy during the final months of his life. The recognition was humbling and infuriating in equal measure. I had been proud of our marriage, of the respect and trust that allowed us to maintain individual interests while building shared goals and values. I had believed that our communication was honest and comprehensive, that we discussed everything that mattered to either of us. Now I understood that David had been managing complex circumstances that I had never suspected, making decisions that would affect both our futures without including me in the process. Whether his secrecy had been motivated by protection or deception, it had deprived me of the opportunity to participate in choices that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our shared life. The evening brought another discovery that would reshape my understanding of recent events. While searching through David's dresser for clothing that might be donated to charity, I found a small notebook tucked beneath folded sweaters. The notebook contained appointments and reminders written in David's precise handwriting, documenting a schedule one had never been aware he was maintaining. The entries created a timeline of regular commitments that explained David's occasional late arrivals home from work and his weekend errands, that sometimes extended longer than grocery shopping or hardware store visits would require. The appointments were coded with initials and locations rather than complete names and addresses, but the pattern was clear. David had been meeting regularly with someone identified only as M at various locations throughout the city. Some entries included emotional notations that revealed the complexity of the situation he had been navigating. M very tired today, Emma fussy during feeding. M asking about long-term plans, need to discuss options. Emma walked 3 steps, M excited but worried about future. The notebook painted a picture of David's involvement in a developing crisis that required both practical assistance and emotional support. The woman identified as M appeared to be Emma's mother, someone whose health challenges were affecting her ability to care for her daughter independently. David's notes suggested that he had been providing regular help while trying to develop sustainable solutions for Emma's long-term welfare. But even this more sympathetic interpretation of David's behavior failed to explain why he had chosen to handle such significant responsibilities without informing his wife. Whether Emma was his biological daughter, the child of a friend in crisis, or someone he had met through circumstances I could not yet imagine, his decision to provide ongoing care should have involved discussion with the person who shared his home, his finances, and his future plans. I called David's closest friend, Michael Torres, whom I had not spoken with since the funeral. Michael and David had maintained their friendship since college, despite living in different cities for several years after graduation. When David returned to accept his current position, they had resumed regular contact through monthly dinners and occasional weekend activities. Michael's surprise at my questions about David's recent behavior seemed genuine, but he admitted that their conversations during the past year had become less frequent and more superficial than in previous periods of their friendship. David seemed distracted during our last few conversations, Michael acknowledged. When I asked about it, he said he was dealing with a complicated situation that he was not ready to discuss. I assumed it was work-related stress, or maybe marriage counseling that you had both decided to keep private. The suggestion that our marriage might have been experiencing difficulties significant enough to require professional intervention was shocking, but I recognized that Michael's interpretation of David's distraction had been reasonable based on the limited information David had chosen to share. Did he ever mention children or express interest in becoming a father? I asked, though I realized that such direct questions might reveal more about my current situation than I was prepared to discuss with David's friends. Michael paused before responding, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone choosing words that would not cause additional pain. David always said that he wanted children eventually, but that the timing needed to be right for both of you. During our last conversation, he mentioned that his priorities had been shifting and that he was reconsidering some major life decisions. I thought he might be planning to suggest that you restart fertility treatments or consider adoption. The conversation ended with Michael's offer to provide any additional information that might help me understand David's final months. But I recognized that my husband had been equally secretive with his closest friend, as he had been with his wife. Whatever circumstances had led to Emma's presence in his life, David had managed the situation in complete isolation, denying himself the support and guidance that honest communication might have provided. As I prepared for another sleepless night, I realized that my investigation had revealed the scope of David's secret without clarifying his motivations or Emma's current circumstances. I knew that a child named Emma had been receiving David's care and attention for nearly a year, that her mother faced health challenges that affected her parenting capacity, and that David had been considering formal arrangements that would have provided Emma with legal protection and financial security. But I did not know where Emma was now, whether she was safe, or who was providing the care that David's death had suddenly eliminated. I did not know whether his involvement had appropriate or inappropriate, whether he had been responding to crisis or creating complications through choices that affected people who had not consented to his decisions. What I did know was that Emma's welfare had become my responsibility, not through legal obligation but through moral commitment to completing the work that David's death had left unfinished. If a child was suffering because of decisions my husband had made, then I would need to find her and ensure that she received appropriate care and protection. The woman who had spent 3 weeks focused entirely on her own grief was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her husband's death had created obligations that extended beyond paying bills and selling possessions. I had been transformed by discovery into an advocate for a child I had never met, driven by questions that would require courage and determination to answer. I did not yet understand that this transformation would reveal capabilities I had never been required to develop, or that Emma would become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my life. I only knew that tomorrow would bring continued searching, and that I would not rest until I understood who Emma was and what she needed from the person who had inherited her protector's responsibilities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source during my third day of investigation. While reviewing David's credit card statements with forensic attention to detail, I discovered a recurring charge to St. Catherine's Family Services, a nonprofit organization that provided support to single mothers facing crisis situations. The monthly payments of $250 had begun 11 months earlier and continued until the week before David's death. The timing aligned perfectly with the baby supply purchases and the coded appointments in David's notebook, suggesting that his involvement with Emma had originated through formal channels rather than casual encounter or inappropriate relationship. St. Catherine's operated programs that connected volunteer mentors with families requiring temporary assistance, providing both financial support and practical help during periods of instability. I arrived at their offices without an appointment, driven by urgency that had been building since discovering Emma's existence. The organization occupied a modest building in the downtown area, its waiting room filled with mothers holding children of various ages, while completing paperwork or consulting with caseworkers. The atmosphere conveyed both hope and desperation, the complex emotions of people seeking help while maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances. The receptionist, a woman named Carol, who appeared to be in her 60s, listened patiently as I explained my situation and requested information about David's involvement with their programs. Her expression shifted from professional courtesy to recognition when I mentioned his name and the monthly contributions that appeared on his financial records. "Mr. Walker was one of our most dedicated volunteer mentors," she said, consulting files that documented his participation in their family support program. He worked with several families over the past year, providing both financial assistance and practical help with childcare and transportation needs. This information reframed David's secret activities in ways that were both relieving and troubling. He had been responding to legitimate need through established channels, not engaging in inappropriate relationships or creating complications through poor judgment. But his decision to participate in such intensive volunteer work without discussing it with his spouse revealed communication patterns in our marriage that I had not previously recognized or addressed. One family in particular required significant support, Carol continued, consulting additional records that provided context for David's coded notebook entries. The mother faced serious health challenges that affected her ability to care for her young daughter independently. Mr. Walker provided regular assistance and was in the process of exploring more formal arrangements when the accident occurred. I felt relief at confirmation that David's involvement had been appropriate and beneficial, but also frustration at his choice to maintain complete secrecy about work that clearly provided him with substantial satisfaction and purpose. The monthly financial contributions represented money we could have allocated together, volunteer time that might have enriched our marriage if he had invited my participation rather than excluding me entirely. "The family he was working with has been struggling since his death," Carol added, her voice carrying the weight of professional concern. "The mother's condition has deteriorated, and she needs someone to assume temporary guardianship of her daughter while she receives treatment." Mr. Walker had indicated his willingness to provide that support, but his death has left the situation unresolved. Emma. The child I had been searching for was in immediate need of placement and protection that David's death had suddenly eliminated. Her mother required medical care that was incompatible with single parenting, and the informal support system David had provided was no longer available to bridge the gap between crisis and stability. "What happens to Emma now?" I asked, using the child's name for the first time in conversation with someone who might actually know her circumstances and needs. Carol's expression became cautious, the look of a professional who recognized the potential complexity of sharing information about vulnerable clients with someone whose relationship to the situation was unclear. "I cannot discuss specific client information without proper authorization," she replied. "But I can tell you that we are working with the county to identify appropriate temporary placement while the mother receives necessary medical treatment. The phrase temporary placement carried implications that made my chest tighten with anxiety. Emma was facing separation from her mother and placement with strangers during a period when stability and continuity were essential for her emotional well-being. The volunteer mentor who had provided consistent support for nearly a year was gone, leaving her to navigate this crisis without the relationship that had apparently become central to her sense of security. I requested an appointment with Emma's caseworker, a woman named Linda Rodriguez who managed family support services for St. Catharines and coordinated with county social services when formal intervention became necessary. Linda agreed to meet with me the following morning, though she emphasized that her ability to share information would depend on privacy regulations and the specific circumstances of Emma's case. That evening, I contacted David's mother to discuss discoveries that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her son's final months. Janet Walker had been my primary source of emotional support during the weeks following David's death, and I needed her guidance in navigating responsibilities I was not prepared to handle independently. Janet's reaction to news about Emma combined shock with immediate concern for the child's welfare. Her maternal instincts engaged immediately, focusing on practical questions about Emma's current circumstances and needs, rather than the implications of David's secrecy for our family relationships. "David always wanted children," she said, her voice carrying sadness for dreams that had been complicated by our fertility struggles and her son's unexpected death. "If he found a way to care for a child who needed protection, I am proud of his choice, even if I wish he had felt comfortable sharing that decision with us." Janet's response revealed the generosity of spirit that had made her such valuable support during my bereavement period, but it also highlighted the isolation David had chosen in managing his relationship with Emma. His mother would have been enthusiastic about his volunteer work and supportive of his efforts to help a family in crisis. His choice to maintain secrecy had deprived both Emma and our family of connections that could have provided additional resources and stability. "What can we do to help Emma now?" Janet asked, her voice carrying the determination of someone prepared to take action once she understood what needed to be done. The question forced me to articulate intentions I had not yet fully formed. My investigation had begun as an effort to understand David's hidden activities and resolve mysteries that his death had created. But the more I learned about Emma's circumstances, the more I felt obligated to provide support that would honor David's commitment while addressing needs that his death had left unmet. "I want to explore whether temporary guardianship might be possible," I replied, recognizing that this decision would fundamentally alter my life in ways I was not prepared to predict or control. Janet's immediate agreement provided validation for instincts I had been hesitant to trust. David's mother understood that our family's response to Emma's crisis would define how we honored his memory and values, and that turning away from a child he had protected would represent betrayal of everything he had worked toward during his final months. The meeting with Linda Rodriguez took place in her office at St. Catharines, a space that balanced professional efficiency with warmth designed to put families at ease during difficult conversations. Linda possessed the calm authority of someone who regularly managed complex situations involving vulnerable children and overwhelmed parents, and her assessment of my request for information was thorough but respectful. "Emma is 18 months old," she began, consulting files that documented the family's history with St. Catharines Services. "Her mother, Maria Santos, is 23 years old and has been struggling with lupus that has become increasingly difficult to manage while maintaining full-time parenting responsibilities." The information provided context for David's coded notebook entries and his gradual increase in time and financial resources devoted to supporting this family. Maria's condition had apparently worsened during the period when David's involvement deepened, creating circumstances that required more intensive assistance than their original volunteer arrangement had anticipated. Mr. Walker had been providing childcare several days each week to allow Maria to attend medical appointments and rest during flare-ups that affected her energy and mobility, Linda continued. He also helped with grocery shopping, transportation, and other practical needs that became difficult for Maria to manage independently. This description revealed the scope of David's commitment and explained the systematic nature of his involvement with Emma's care. He had been functioning as an extended family member or co-parent, providing support that enabled Maria to maintain custody while receiving necessary medical treatment. Maria's condition has deteriorated significantly since Mr. Walker's death, Linda explained. She requires hospitalization for treatment that will last several weeks, followed by an extended recovery period during which she will not be able to provide full-time childcare. Emma needed temporary placement that would provide stability and continuity during her mother's treatment and recovery. The county had resources for emergency foster care, but Linda's expression suggested that she believed Emma would benefit from placement with someone who understood her history and could maintain connections to the life David had helped create for her. "Would you be interested in exploring temporary guardianship?" Linda asked, voicing the question I had been afraid to ask directly. The request represented everything I had been moving toward during 3 days of investigation, but hearing it articulated by a professional who understood Emma's needs made the magnitude of the decision suddenly clear. I would be accepting responsibility for an 18-month-old child whose mother I had never met, whose routines I did not understand, and whose emotional needs had been shaped by a relationship with my deceased husband that I was still trying to comprehend. But I would also be honoring David's commitment to a family that had depended on his support, providing continuity for a child who had already experienced significant loss, and potentially helping Maria maintain her parental rights during a medical crisis that was temporary rather than permanent. What would temporary guardianship involve? I asked, needing practical information before I could make commitments that would affect Emma's welfare and my own capacity to provide appropriate care. Linda explained the legal process for emergency guardianship, the requirements for home evaluation and background screening, and the support services available through St. Catharines and County Social Services. The process was designed to move quickly when children faced immediate need for placement, but it required commitment from guardians who understood the complexity of caring for children who had experienced trauma and instability. "Emma has been asking for Uncle David constantly since his death," Linda added, providing information that made the child's emotional reality suddenly concrete and heartbreaking. "She does not understand why he stopped coming to see her, and she has become increasingly distressed during her mother's recent hospitalizations." The image of Emma calling for David while struggling to understand his absence created urgency that overwhelmed my remaining hesitation about accepting guardianship responsibilities. This child had lost someone she loved and depended upon, and she needed adults who would provide stability while she processed grief and confusion that she was too young to articulate or manage independently. "I would like to meet Emma and discuss guardianship arrangements with Maria," I said, recognizing that this decision would define the next phase of my life in ways that I could not predict, but was prepared to embrace. Linda's smile indicated approval and relief that Emma might receive care from someone connected to the support system that had sustained her family during the previous months. She scheduled meetings for the following day that would allow me to understand Emma's needs directly and discuss arrangements with Maria that honored both David's commitment and the family's preferences for Emma's care. The drive home through afternoon traffic provided time to process the magnitude of what I was considering. 3 days earlier, I had been a childless widow focused on managing grief and settling my husband's affairs. Now I was preparing to become temporary guardian for a toddler I had never met, whose mother was facing serious illness, and whose emotional stability had been disrupted by the same accident that had shattered my own assumptions about the future. But the decision felt right in ways that were both surprising and deeply satisfying. David had chosen to protect Emma when she needed advocacy and support, and his death had created obligations that extended beyond legal requirements to moral commitments about continuing work that mattered to him and to families who depended on it. I was about to discover that accepting responsibility for Emma's welfare would reveal capabilities I had never developed and create connections that would transform my understanding of family, community, and my own potential for making meaningful differences in circumstances that seemed impossible to improve. The woman who had spent weeks focused on her own loss was preparing to become someone whose primary concern was ensuring that a child received the love and stability she deserved during the most vulnerable period of her young life. The pediatric wing of St. Mary's Hospital carried the distinctive scent of antiseptic, mixed with the lingering sweetness of juice boxes and animal crackers. I walked through corridors lined with colorful murals depicting cartoon characters and rainbow landscapes, my hands trembling slightly as I approached the room where Emma Santos was staying while her mother received treatment in the intensive care unit 3 floors above. Linda Rodriguez had prepared me for this meeting with detailed information about Emma's routine, her favorite foods, and the words she used to communicate her basic needs. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for the emotional impact of seeing David's carefully documented handwriting come to life in the form of a dark-haired toddler who looked up from her hospital bed with eyes that held both wariness and desperate hope. Emma was smaller than I had expected, though Linda had assured me that her size was appropriate for her 18-month age. She wore pink pajamas decorated with elephants and clutched the same stuffed giraffe I had discovered in David's car seat, her expression shifting between curiosity about my presence and anxiety about yet another unfamiliar adult entering her disrupted world. "Emma, this is Mrs. Walker," Linda said gently, using the formal introduction approach that respected Emma's need to assess new people at her own pace. "She was married to Uncle David, and she would like to meet you." The mention of David's name produced an immediate reaction. Emma's face brightened with recognition and longing, and she extended her small arms toward me while repeating Uncle David, with the hopeful insistence of someone who believed that invoking his name might somehow make him appear. My throat constricted with emotion as I approached her bed and allowed her to examine my face with the serious attention that toddlers reserve for determining whether adults can be trusted to meet their needs adequately. After several moments of silent evaluation, Emma tentatively touched my hand and whispered, "Mama's sick," with a gravity that seemed far beyond her chronological age. The interaction lasted only 20 minutes, but it provided sufficient insight into Emma's personality and current emotional state to confirm my decision about temporary guardianship. She demonstrated the resilience that children develop when they experience early disruption, but also the vulnerability that required consistent adult protection and reassurance during periods of instability. Linda escorted me to the intensive care unit where Maria Santos was receiving treatment for lupus complications that had been exacerbated by stress and exhaustion related to single parenting during chronic illness. Maria appeared younger than her 23 years, her face drawn with fatigue but alert with maternal concern as Linda explained my relationship to David and my interest in providing temporary care for Emma. Maria's initial response combined gratitude with protective scrutiny, as she evaluated my motivations and capabilities for caring for her daughter during her hospitalization and recovery period. Her questions revealed both intelligence and fierce dedication to Emma's welfare, despite health challenges that had made consistent parenting increasingly difficult over recent months. "David told me about his wife," Maria said, her voice soft but steady despite obvious physical discomfort. "He said you worked for a nonprofit organization and that you cared about helping families like ours. He also said you had wanted children but that it had not been possible for medical reasons." The revelation that David had discussed our private struggles with fertility created complex emotions. I felt violated by his sharing of intimate information without my consent, but also moved by evidence that he had seen connections between our personal losses and opportunities to support families facing different but equally challenging circumstances. "David never mentioned you or Emma to me," I replied honestly, recognizing that Maria deserved transparency about the complexity of my relationship to this situation. "I discovered Emma's existence only after his death, through evidence I found in his car and financial records." Maria's expression shifted to confusion and concern as she processed this information. David said he had discussed becoming Emma's temporary guardian with his family, and that everyone supported the arrangement. He said the legal paperwork was nearly complete. The discrepancy between David's representations to Maria and the reality of his complete secrecy with his wife created immediate complications for trust and communication. Maria had been making decisions about Emma's care based on information that was incorrect, while I had been excluded from discussions that would have fundamentally affected our family's future. David may have intended to discuss these arrangements with me, but died before those conversations could occur, I said, choosing language that preserved his reputation while acknowledging the communication failures that had created confusion for everyone involved. Maria studied my face with the intensity of someone whose child's welfare depended on accurate assessment of adult reliability and commitment. After several moments, she reached for my hand and spoke with quiet determination. "Emma needs someone who will love her and protect her while I get better," she said. "David promised that she would be safe and that I would not lose her because of my illness. If you are willing to honor that promise, I will trust you with the most important thing in my life." The conversation continued for another hour as Maria provided detailed information about Emma's routines, preferences, and developmental needs. She described Emma's love of music and books, her fear of loud noises, and her need for consistent bedtime rituals that provided security during periods of change and uncertainty. Maria also shared information about her medical condition and prognosis that helped me understand the timeline and requirements for Emma's temporary placement. Her treatment would require 4 to 6 weeks of hospitalization followed by several months of recovery at home, during which she would gradually rebuild her capacity for independent parenting. The arrangement we discussed would provide Emma with stability during her mother's treatment while preserving Maria's parental rights and maintaining their relationship through regular visits and communication. I would become Emma's temporary guardian with legal authority to make decisions about her daily care, medical needs, and educational development. But Maria would remain her mother and primary decision-maker regarding major life choices. Linda scheduled the necessary appointments for home evaluation, background screening, and legal documentation that would formalize the guardianship arrangement. The process moved with bureaucratic efficiency, designed to protect children's interests, while recognizing the urgency of Emma's need for stable placement during her mother's medical crisis. 3 days later, I stood in my apartment surveying the changes that had transformed our adult living space into an environment suitable for toddler care. Janet Walker had coordinated a remarkable mobilization of family resources, arriving with David's cousins and their children to install safety gates, relocate breakable objects, and establish the nursery that David and I had never been able to create for our own biological children. The spare bedroom that had served as David's home office was converted into Emma's room, complete with the crib that Janet had saved from David's infancy, and the toys that accumulated through donations from family members whose own children had outgrown them. The transformation felt both surreal and deeply meaningful, as if David's secret commitment to Emma had finally found expression in the home we had shared. Emma arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by Linda Rodriguez and accompanied by 2 suitcases containing clothing, toys, and medical records that documented her short but complicated life. She clutched her stuffed giraffe and surveyed her new environment with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to assume that changes would be positive or permanent. The initial hours tested every parenting instinct I had never been required to develop. Emma's routine had been disrupted by hospital stays and multiple caregivers, and she alternated between periods of cooperation and episodes of distress that seemed disproportionate to minor frustrations, like having her diaper changed or being offered unfamiliar food. But gradually, as the day progressed and Emma began to recognize that this environment provided consistency and gentle attention to her needs, she began to relax into the rhythms that would define our new life together. She allowed me to feed her lunch and read books during nap time, and she even smiled when I attempted to sing the songs that David had documented as her favorites. The evening brought our first major challenge when Emma's bedtime routine triggered intense crying that continued despite my efforts to provide comfort through feeding, rocking, and the familiar songs that had previously calmed her distress. Her crying escalated into the inconsolable grief of someone who had lost too much stability in too short a period and could not understand why the adult she depended upon kept disappearing from her life. I called Linda Rodriguez for guidance, but her suggestions about consistent bedtime routines and patient reassurance provided little practical help with a toddler who seemed determined to cry until David returned to restore the life she had known before his death. After 2 hours of unsuccessful attempts to provide comfort, I finally lay down beside Emma's crib and began talking to her about David, describing the love he had felt for her and the ways his memory would remain present even though he could not return. The conversation was one-sided, since Emma's vocabulary was limited to basic words and phrases, but something in my tone or the familiar subject matter seemed to provide comfort that my previous efforts had failed to achieve. Her crying gradually subsided into exhausted whimpers, and she fell asleep clutching her giraffe while I continued talking softly about David's commitment to her welfare and my promise to honor his care until her mother recovered. The next morning brought news that would complicate our arrangement and test my commitment to Emma's welfare in ways I had not anticipated. Linda Rodriguez called to inform me that Maria's condition had deteriorated overnight, requiring additional treatment that would extend her hospitalization by several weeks and potentially affect her long-term capacity for independent parenting. The medical team believes Maria will recover fully, but the timeline has become uncertain, Linda explained. Emma's temporary placement may need to continue longer than originally anticipated, possibly for several months rather than weeks. The extension meant that Emma's care would require greater adaptation of my work schedule, living arrangements, and financial resources. It also meant that my relationship with Emma would deepen beyond temporary caretaking into something approaching surrogate parenting during a critical period of her emotional and developmental growth. I discussed the situation with my supervisor, Margaret Chen, explaining the circumstances that had led to Emma's placement and requesting flexible work arrangements that would accommodate childcare responsibilities during Maria's extended treatment. Margaret's response revealed both personal sympathy and institutional concern about the potential impact of my new obligations on workplace productivity and professional focus. "We support employees facing family emergencies," Margaret said, "but we need to understand how long-term this arrangement might become, and whether you will be able to maintain your current responsibilities while providing appropriate care for Emma." The question forced me to articulate commitments I was still learning to understand myself. Emma's welfare had become my primary concern, superseding career advancement and personal convenience in ways that surprised me with their clarity and intensity. I was discovering maternal instincts I had never been able to express through biological parenthood. And those instincts were reshaping my priorities in fundamental ways. Emma's mother is expected to recover fully, and our arrangement is designed to preserve their relationship while providing Emma with stability during Maria's treatment, I replied. I am committed to Emma's welfare for as long as she needs support, and I will adapt my work responsibilities to ensure that both commitments receive appropriate attention. Margaret agreed to temporary schedule modifications that would allow me to work primarily during Emma's nap time and evening hours, supplemented by occasional childcare assistance from Janet Walker and other family members who had embraced Emma as part of our extended support network. The arrangement required significant adjustments to routines I had maintained for years, but it also provided structure and purpose that grief had disrupted since David's death. Caring for Emma demanded focus on immediate, practical needs that left little time for the rumination and self-pity that had characterized my initial response to widowhood. More importantly, Emma's presence in my life created connections to David's values and commitments that honored his memory in ways that simply preserving his possessions or visiting his grave could never achieve. Through caring for the child he had protected, I was participating in work that had provided him with satisfaction and meaning during his final months. The first week of our life together established routines that balanced Emma's needs for consistency with my requirements for productivity and adult interaction. Mornings were devoted to childcare, meals, and developmental activities that supported Emma's growth, while providing opportunities for bonding and communication. Afternoons included nap time that allowed me to complete work assignments and maintain professional obligations from home. Evenings were reserved for family time, including video calls with Maria that preserved Emma's connection to her mother despite their physical separation. The arrangement was not perfect, and it required constant adjustment as Emma's needs evolved and unexpected challenges arose. But it was working in ways that surprised everyone who had doubted whether someone without parenting experience could successfully care for a toddler who had experienced significant trauma and disruption. Emma was thriving under consistent care and attention that addressed both her practical needs and her emotional requirements for security and affection. Her vocabulary was expanding, her sleep patterns were stabilizing, and she was beginning to demonstrate the curiosity and playfulness that had been suppressed during periods of instability and uncertainty. I was also thriving in ways I had not expected, discovering capabilities for patience, creativity, and unconditional love that had remained dormant during years of focusing on career advancement and adult relationships. Emma's dependence on my care and protection had awakened instincts that transformed my understanding of my own potential and priorities. The woman who had spent 3 weeks focused on processing grief and settling estate obligations had become someone whose primary identity centered on nurturing a child who needed advocacy and protection during the most vulnerable period of her young life. The transformation felt both natural and revolutionary, as if I had finally discovered work that utilized abilities I had never been required to develop or demonstrate. The knock at my apartment door came at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, during the quiet hour when Emma typically played with blocks while I prepared her dinner. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the patient expression of someone prepared to wait until I decided whether to answer. Dr. Sarah Martinez introduced herself as Maria Santos's physician at St. Mary's Hospital, explaining that she had obtained my contact information from Linda Rodriguez after learning about Emma's temporary placement. Her presence at my door represented an unprecedented breach of professional protocol, and her careful explanation revealed both the complexity of Maria's medical situation and her own commitment to ensuring Emma's welfare during this extended crisis. Maria's condition has stabilized, but her recovery will require several more weeks of hospitalization, followed by months of careful management at home, Dr. Martinez explained as I invited her inside. She has been asking about Emma constantly, and I wanted to meet the person who has taken responsibility for her care during this critical period. Emma looked up from her blocks as Dr. Martinez entered our living room, her expression shifting to the wariness she displayed when meeting unfamiliar adults. But something in Dr. Martinez's calm presence and gentle voice seemed to reassure her, and she returned to her play while maintaining awareness of our conversation. Dr. Martinez's assessment of Emma's adjustment to temporary placement revealed professional expertise that extended beyond pediatric medicine to understanding of child development and trauma response. She observed Emma's interactions with her toys, her comfort level in the apartment environment, and her responsiveness to my presence and guidance. Emma appears to be thriving under your care, Dr. Martinez observed. Her physical health is excellent, and she demonstrates emotional stability that suggests she feels secure in this environment. Maria will be relieved to know that her daughter is receiving not just adequate care, but genuinely nurturing attention. The validation from someone with professional expertise in child welfare provided reassurance that my instinctive approaches to Emma's care were appropriate and beneficial. During the past 2 weeks, I had been learning to interpret Emma's needs through trial and error, guided by Linda Rodriguez's suggestions and Janet Walker's grandmotherly wisdom, but uncertain whether my inexperience was affecting Emma's development or emotional well-being. Dr. Martinez's visit had deeper purposes than simple evaluation of Emma's current circumstances. She had come to discuss Maria's long-term prognosis and the implications for Emma's permanent placement, conversations that would require adult decision-making about custody arrangements that extended beyond temporary crisis management. Maria's lupus is manageable with proper treatment and lifestyle modifications, but she will need ongoing medical supervision and assistance with parenting responsibilities, Dr. Martinez explained. She is a devoted mother, but single parenting during chronic illness creates challenges that require community support and resource coordination. The information provided context for David's involvement with Maria's family and his consideration of formal guardianship arrangements. His monthly contributions to St. Catherine's Family Services and his regular assistance with childcare had addressed immediate needs, while Maria established medical care and learned to manage her condition. But the sustainability of this support system had depended on his continued participation. David Walker had discussed with Maria the possibility of shared custody arrangements that would provide Emma with stability while preserving Maria's parental rights, Dr. Martinez continued. His death has eliminated that option, but Maria remains hopeful that similar arrangements might be possible with someone who understands Emma's needs and shares David's commitment to her welfare. The suggestion carried implications that I had been avoiding since accepting temporary guardianship responsibilities. Emma's placement in my home had been intended as crisis intervention during Maria's hospitalization, but the extension of Maria's treatment timeline and the complexity of her ongoing medical needs suggested that Emma might benefit from more permanent arrangements that provided stability while maintaining her relationship with her biological mother. Dr. Martinez had come to explore whether I might be interested in formal co-parenting arrangements that would address both Emma's need for consistency and Maria's desire to remain actively involved in her daughter's upbringing. Such arrangements were uncommon but legally possible, requiring court approval and careful documentation of responsibilities and decision-making authority. I am not suggesting that you make immediate commitments about Emma's permanent placement, Dr. Martinez clarified. But Maria would like to meet with you to discuss possibilities for ongoing collaboration in Emma's care, regardless of the specific legal arrangements that might evolve over time. The request represented both opportunity and complication. Meeting with Maria would allow me to understand her perspectives on Emma's needs and her vision for their future together, but it would also require me to articulate my own intentions regarding the role I wanted to play in Emma's life beyond temporary crisis management. During the 2 weeks since Emma's arrival, I had been focused on addressing her immediate needs for safety, nutrition, and emotional comfort. I had not allowed myself to consider the possibility that our relationship might continue beyond Maria's recovery, or that Emma might become a permanent part of my family through arrangements that honored both her mother's rights and her own need for stability. But Dr. Martinez's visit forced me to acknowledge feelings I had been suppressing since Emma's first night in my apartment. I loved this child with intensity that surprised me with its immediacy and depth. Emma had awakened maternal instincts that fertility treatments and adoption agencies had never been able to activate, and the prospect of losing her when Maria recovered created anxiety that I had not expected to experience. "I would be honored to meet with Maria and discuss Emma's future," I replied, recognizing that this conversation would require honesty about my growing attachment to Emma and my desire to remain involved in her life regardless of the specific arrangements that might evolve. Dr. Martinez scheduled the meeting for the following weekend, when Maria's medical team expected her to be stable enough for extended conversation about complex personal matters. The timing would also allow me to arrange childcare for Emma, since discussions about her future would require adult focus that would not be possible with an active toddler demanding attention. The week between Dr. Martinez's visit and the scheduled meeting with Maria passed with heightened awareness of Emma's developmental progress and our evolving relationship. I documented her expanding vocabulary, her increasing comfort with separation when I worked in another room, and her growing attachment to routines we had established together. Emma had begun calling me Mama Claire, rather than the formal Mrs. Walker that Linda Rodriguez had initially used for introductions. The name change reflected her acceptance of me as a primary caregiver rather than temporary supervisor, and it created emotional reactions that I struggled to process without making commitments about permanent arrangements. Janet Walker's response to Emma's linguistic evolution provided perspective that helped me understand the significance of this development. "Children Emma's age do not form deep attachments casually," she explained during one of her regular visits to provide childcare assistance. "Her comfort with you and her use of maternal language suggests that she feels genuinely secure in your care." Janet's observation was supported by Emma's behavior during our daily activities. She sought comfort from me when tired or frustrated, she included me in her playthrough gestures and babbled conversations, and she demonstrated preference for my presence over other caregivers when multiple adults were available. The attachment was mutual. Emma's needs had become my primary concern, superseding work obligations and social commitments in ways that felt natural rather than burdensome. I found satisfaction in her developmental achievements, comfort in her affectionate responses to my care, and purpose in advocating for her welfare during interactions with medical professionals and social service providers. The meeting with Maria Santos took place in a family conference room at St. Mary's Hospital, a space designed to facilitate difficult conversations about medical decisions and care planning. Maria appeared stronger than during our previous encounter, though still pale and careful in her movements as she adjusted to medications that managed her lupus symptoms while allowing greater mobility and energy. Maria's first questions focused entirely on Emma's adjustment to temporary placement and her emotional response to separation from familiar caregivers. Her maternal concern was evident in every inquiry about Emma's eating habits, sleep patterns, and social interactions, revealing both love and anxiety about decisions she had been forced to make during medical crisis. "Emma seems happy when we video chat, but I worry that she will forget me if this separation continues much longer," Maria said, voicing fears that any parent would experience when unable to provide daily care for their child. I shared observations about Emma's responses to our video calls with Maria, her excitement when hearing her mother's voice, and her careful attention to the screen during their conversations. Emma clearly remembered and loved Maria, and their relationship remained strong despite physical separation and the disruption of their previous routines. "Emma talks about you constantly, even though her vocabulary is limited," I assured Maria. "She points to your photograph and says Mama with recognition and affection. Your relationship with her is not threatened by temporary placement." The conversation continued with Maria sharing information about her medical prognosis and her plans for creating stable housing and childcare arrangements that would support Emma's return to her primary care. Maria's recovery timeline remained uncertain, but her commitment to regaining full parenting capacity was absolute and inspiring. "I want Emma to have the best possible life, with or without me," Maria said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had learned to make difficult decisions based on love rather than personal preference. David promised that Emma would be protected and provided for, regardless of what happened to my health. I hope that promise can still be honored. The statement created an opening for discussing long-term arrangements that might benefit both Emma and Maria, while acknowledging the reality of Maria's ongoing medical needs and my growing attachment to Emma's welfare. I had prepared for this conversation by researching legal options for shared custody and co-parenting arrangements that preserved biological parental rights while providing additional stability and resources. "I have grown to love Emma deeply during these weeks," I said, choosing directness over diplomatic evasion. "I would be honored to continue playing a significant role in her life, whether that means occasional childcare assistance or more formal arrangements that provide ongoing support for both of you." Maria's response revealed relief and gratitude that Emma had formed genuine attachments during temporary placement rather than simply receiving adequate custodial care. Her primary concern had been that Emma would experience additional trauma through placement with caregivers who viewed her as obligation rather than opportunity for meaningful relationship. "David told me that you had wanted children, but that medical problems had prevented biological parenthood," Maria continued. "He said you would understand the love required to put a child's needs before adult preferences, and that you would never try to replace a biological parent but would support whatever arrangements served Emma's best interests." The conversation revealed David's thoughtful consideration of personality and values when he had contemplated involving me in Emma's care. His assessment of my character and priorities had been accurate, though his failure to discuss these possibilities with me directly had created complications that we were now working to resolve through honest communication and shared commitment to Emma's welfare. Over the following 2 hours, Maria and I developed preliminary agreements about shared responsibility for Emma's care that addressed both immediate needs and long-term planning. The arrangements would provide Emma with 2 loving homes and multiple adults committed to her development and protection, while allowing Maria to maintain her primary parental role despite ongoing medical challenges. The legal framework would require court approval and professional mediation to ensure that everyone's rights and responsibilities were clearly defined and protected. But the emotional foundation for successful co-parenting had been established through honest discussion about our mutual love for Emma and our commitment to prioritizing her needs over adult convenience or conventional family structures. Dr. Martinez's presence during portions of our conversation provided medical perspective on Maria's capacity for shared parenting and Emma's developmental needs during the transition period. Her professional endorsement of our proposed arrangements would carry significant weight during legal proceedings and social service evaluations. "Emma is fortunate to have 2 mothers who prioritize her welfare over personal preferences," Dr. Martinez observed. "Shared custody arrangements can provide children with enhanced stability and resources when all parties are committed to collaboration and communication." The meeting concluded with specific plans for gradually increasing Emma's time with Maria as her medical condition stabilized, while maintaining her primary placement in my home until more permanent arrangements could be formalized through appropriate legal channels. The transition would be managed carefully to minimize disruption to Emma's routines, while rebuilding her daily relationship with her biological mother. As I prepared to leave the hospital, Maria asked to record a video message for Emma that I could share during her bedtime routine. The message expressed Maria's love and explained that she was getting better so she could be Emma's mama again, but that Emma was safe and loved with Mama Claire until they could be together more often. The drive home provided time to process the magnitude of what Maria and I had discussed and the commitment I had made to shared responsibility for Emma's future. The arrangement would require significant adjustments to my lifestyle, career planning, and personal relationships, but it would also provide Emma with enhanced stability and support during her formative years. More importantly, the co-parenting arrangement would honor David's vision for Emma's care, while creating opportunities for both Maria and me to experience the joys and challenges of raising a child who had already demonstrated remarkable resilience and capacity for love, despite early experiences of loss and instability. I had discovered an unexpected ally in Maria Santos. a young mother whose strength and commitment to her daughter's welfare had inspired me to expand my own understanding of family, community, and the possibilities for creating positive change in circumstances that initially seemed impossible to improve. The phone call from David's brother Marcus came at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, interrupting Emma's dinner routine and carrying news that would fundamentally challenge the arrangements Maria and I had developed for her ongoing care. Marcus Walker's voice carried the formal tone he typically reserved for difficult conversations, and his request for an immediate family meeting suggested complications that extended beyond routine concerns about Emma's temporary placement. "Claire, we need to discuss Emma's situation as a family," Marcus said, his words carefully measured in the manner of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "There are legal and financial implications that affect all of us, and decisions need to be made about her long-term placement that consider everyone's interests and responsibilities." The summons felt ominous, transforming what had been supportive family collaboration into something resembling an intervention or tribunal. During the 3 weeks since Emma's arrival, the Walker family had been unanimously supportive of the temporary guardianship arrangement, with Janet coordinating childcare assistance and other relatives contributing resources and encouragement without question or criticism. But Marcus's tone suggested that this consensus had deteriorated, replaced by concerns about my growing attachment to Emma and the implications of co-parenting arrangements that would make my relationship with her permanent rather than temporary. The family meeting he proposed would require me to defend decisions I had made in consultation with Maria and her medical team, subjecting our carefully developed plans to scrutiny from people who had not participated in their formation. Emma sensed the tension in my voice during the phone conversation, looking up from her high chair with the alert expression she displayed when adult conversations carried emotional weight she could not understand, but instinctively recognized as significant. Her reaction reminded me that these discussions about her future would affect her daily reality in ways that adult participants might overlook, while focusing on legal technicalities and family dynamics. The meeting took place the following afternoon at Janet Walker's house, where the familiar comfort of David's childhood home had been transformed into a formal setting for family decision-making. Marcus arrived with his wife Catherine, and a manila folder containing documents that suggested extensive preparation for this confrontation. Janet appeared uncomfortable with the adversarial atmosphere, but she had clearly agreed to host the meeting despite personal reservations about its necessity. David's sister Caroline participated through video conference from Seattle, her presence on Janet's tablet adding technological complexity to emotional discussions that would have been difficult enough with all participants physically present. The arrangement emphasized the seriousness with which the family approached these decisions, while creating communication barriers that complicated honest dialogue about sensitive subjects. Marcus began the meeting by outlining concerns that he characterized as representing the entire family's perspective, though Janet's expression suggested she had not been consulted about his authority to speak on behalf of everyone present. His presentation emphasized legal liability, financial responsibility, and potential complications that could arise from my continued involvement in Emma's care beyond the original temporary arrangement. "Emma is not legally David's daughter, and she has no biological relationship to our family," Marcus stated, consulting notes that transformed personal relationships into abstract legal categories. "Claire's emotional attachment to her is understandable given recent grief and the circumstances of discovering David's volunteer work, but permanent custody arrangements would create obligations and liabilities that extend far beyond what David originally intended." The characterization of my relationship with Emma as grief-motivated rather than genuine maternal affection was insulting and dismissive, reducing weeks of devoted caregiving to psychological dysfunction that required family intervention. Marcus's analysis ignored Emma's documented thriving under my care, and the professional validation I had received from Linda Rodriguez, Dr. Martinez, and other experts who had observed our interactions. Catherine Walker supported her husband's position by raising concerns about the financial implications of shared custody arrangements, particularly regarding health insurance, educational expenses, and legal fees associated with formalizing co-parenting agreements. Her questions revealed detailed research into the potential costs of long-term commitment to Emma's welfare, suggesting that the family viewed my growing attachment as financially imprudent rather than morally admirable. "We are not questioning Claire's good intentions or her affection for Emma," Catherine explained, her tone carrying the patronizing sympathy reserved for family members whose judgment requires correction. But we are concerned about the practical implications of permanent arrangements that were never part of David's original plan for helping this family. Caroline's participation through video conference added geographic distance to emotional separation, her questions focusing on how my relationship with Emma might affect future family gatherings, holiday traditions, and inheritance decisions that would become complicated by the presence of a child who was not biologically related to the Walker family. "What happens when Claire remarries and has her own children?" Caroline asked, voicing concerns that revealed assumptions about my future that I had not made myself. "Will Emma always be part of family events, or will she become an uncomfortable reminder of a difficult period that everyone would prefer to move past?" The questions revealed fundamental differences in how family members conceptualized Emma's significance and my relationship to her care. Marcus, Catherine, and Caroline viewed Emma as a temporary obligation inherited from David's charitable work, something to be managed appropriately and concluded when crisis circumstances no longer required family involvement. But Janet's responses during the conversation revealed different perspectives that aligned more closely with my own understanding of Emma's importance and our family's moral obligations to her welfare. Janet had spent significant time with Emma during recent weeks, providing childcare assistance and observing the depth of our mutual attachment, and her assessment emphasized relationship quality over legal technicalities. "Emma calls Claire Mama and looks for her when she wakes up from naps," Janet observed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised children and recognized genuine maternal bonds when she witnessed them. "This is not temporary attachment or grief displacement. This is real love between a mother and daughter, regardless of biological or legal relationships." Janet's support provided validation that strengthened my resolve to defend arrangements that served Emma's best interests, despite family pressure to prioritize convenience over commitment. Her willingness to contradict her son's position in front of other family members demonstrated courage and integrity that honored David's values more than Marcus's legalistic concerns about liability and obligation. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Marcus systematically raising objections to permanent custody arrangements while I provided evidence of Emma's developmental progress, Maria's support for co-parenting plans, and professional endorsements from medical and social service providers who had observed our relationship. But the family meeting revealed a coordinated campaign to discourage my continued involvement in Emma's care that extended beyond spontaneous concerns about practical implications. Marcus had consulted with attorneys about potential legal challenges to custody arrangements. Catherine had researched the financial costs of long-term child rearing, and Caroline had discussed inheritance implications with estate planning professionals. Their preparation suggested that opposition to my relationship with Emma had been developing for weeks, while they maintained public support for temporary guardianship arrangements. The family meeting was designed to pressure me into voluntarily withdrawing from Emma's life, rather than forcing them to take legal action that would create public conflict and potential embarrassment. "We think it would be best for everyone, including Emma, if her permanent placement were handled through appropriate channels with families who have specifically chosen to adopt children from difficult circumstances," Marcus concluded, presenting their coordinated position with the authority of family consensus, despite Janet's obvious disagreement. The suggestion that Emma would be better served by placement with strangers than by continued care from someone who loved her and had demonstrated successful parenting capabilities revealed the depth of their opposition to arrangements that honored both David's commitment and Emma's needs for stability. Marcus's presentation concluded with an ultimatum disguised as family guidance. The Walker family would support temporary guardianship through Maria's recovery period, but they expected me to facilitate Emma's transition to adoptive placement, rather than pursuing permanent co-parenting arrangements that would create ongoing obligations and complications for everyone involved. "This is not about questioning your love for Emma or your capabilities as a caregiver," Marcus emphasized, attempting to soften the impact of his demands through acknowledgement of my emotional investment. "This is about recognizing that David's death changed the circumstances that originally made sense for his involvement with this family, and that permanent solutions need to be based on current reality, rather than plans that can no longer be implemented." The ultimatum created a clear choice between family harmony and Emma's welfare, forcing me to decide whether maintaining relationships with David's relatives was more important than honoring commitments I had made to a child who depended on my advocacy and protection. My response surprised everyone present, including myself, as I articulated positions I had not fully formed until required to defend them against coordinated opposition. The strength in my voice reflected confidence that had developed through weeks of successful caregiving and professional validation from experts who understood Emma's needs and my capabilities. Emma is not a charity case or temporary obligation inherited from David's volunteer work, I stated, looking directly at Marcus while including other family members in my response. She is a child who needs love, stability, and advocacy from adults who prioritize her welfare over their own convenience or social expectations. I continued by describing Emma's developmental progress, her emotional attachment to our established routines, and the professional support I had received for co-parenting arrangements that would preserve her relationship with Maria, while providing additional resources and stability through continued placement in my home. David may not have discussed his plans with me before his death, but his commitment to Emma's welfare is clear from the evidence I discovered and the relationships he built with her family, I explained. Honoring that commitment requires continuing his work, not abandoning Emma when she needs support most. The family meeting concluded without resolution, but with clear understanding that I would proceed with formal custody arrangements regardless of their support or approval. Marcus's final statement emphasized that the family would not provide financial assistance for legal fees or ongoing childcare expenses associated with permanent guardianship, and that my decision to pursue these arrangements would affect my relationship with David's relatives in ways that might prove difficult to repair. Janet's private conversation with me after other family members departed revealed her continued support for Emma's placement and her disappointment with her son's approach to handling these sensitive decisions. Her perspective provided crucial validation that my assessment of Emma's needs and my capabilities as her caregiver were shared by someone whose judgment I trusted, and whose connection to David gave her insights into his likely preferences regarding Emma's future. David would be proud of what you have done for Emma and horrified by Marcus's suggestion that she should be placed with strangers, Janet said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood her son's character and values. You are giving Emma exactly what David would have wanted her to have: a mother who loves her unconditionally and advocates for her needs without regard for personal cost or social pressure. The conversation with Janet provided emotional support that helped me process the stress of family opposition, while maintaining focus on Emma's needs and the legal steps required to formalize our relationship through appropriate channels. Her commitment to continue providing childcare assistance and emotional support meant that Emma would retain connections to David's family, despite Marcus's disapproval of permanent custody arrangements. The week following the family meeting brought additional challenges that tested my resolve to pursue co-parenting arrangements despite organized opposition from people whose approval I had previously valued. Marcus contacted Linda Rodriguez at St. Catherine's Family Services to express concerns about my emotional stability and capacity for long-term child rearing, attempting to undermine professional support for guardianship arrangements through questions about my motivations and qualifications. Linda's response to Marcus's inquiry demonstrated the strength of professional relationships I had built through consistent advocacy for Emma's welfare and transparent communication about challenges and successes in our daily life together. Her defense of my caregiving capabilities and her endorsement of co-parenting plans provided crucial support during a period when family opposition created doubt about decisions I had made with confidence and professional guidance. Claire Walker has demonstrated exceptional commitment to Emma's welfare and remarkable capability in addressing the complex needs of a child who has experienced significant trauma and disruption, Linda wrote in her formal response to Marcus's concerns. Her decision to pursue permanent custody arrangements reflects mature assessment of Emma's needs rather than impulsive reaction to grief or temporary emotional attachment. The professional endorsement strengthened my legal position while providing emotional validation that my assessment of Emma's needs and my capabilities as her advocate were shared by experts who understood child welfare and family dynamics. The support from Linda Rodriguez, Dr. Martinez, and other professionals who had observed our relationship provided confidence that enabled me to withstand family pressure and proceed with formal arrangements that served Emma's best interests. The emergency call from St. Mary's Hospital arrived at 3:17 in the morning, piercing the silence of Emma's peaceful sleep and jolting me into a crisis that would force me to choose between the safety of established routines and the uncertainty of permanent commitment. Dr. Martinez's voice carried professional urgency tempered by personal concern as she explained that Maria Santos had experienced a severe lupus flare that required immediate intensive treatment and would necessitate extended hospitalization beyond previous projections. Maria's condition has deteriorated rapidly over the past 12 hours, drive. Martinez explained while I struggled to process information that would fundamentally alter the timeline for Emma's care arrangements. Her treatment will require aggressive intervention that could extend her hospital stay by several additional weeks, and her recovery period will be significantly longer than we originally anticipated. The medical crisis eliminated the gradual transition timeline that Maria and I had developed for increasing Emma's time with her biological mother while maintaining stability in my home. Instead, Emma would need continued full-time placement with complete uncertainty about when circumstances might allow Maria to resume primary parenting responsibilities. More critically, the emergency created legal vulnerabilities that could result in Emma's placement in county foster care if formal guardianship arrangements were not completed within the timeframe specified by social services regulations. Temporary custody authorizations that had been adequate during Maria's expected short-term treatment would prove insufficient for extended placement that could last several months. You will need to decide within the next 48 hours whether to pursue formal emergency guardianship or allow Emma to be placed in county care while Maria receives treatment, Dr. Martinez continued, articulating the choice that would define Emma's immediate future and my role in providing it. The decision carried implications that extended far beyond legal technicalities to fundamental questions about my commitment to Emma's welfare and my willingness to accept responsibilities that would permanently alter my personal and professional trajectory. Emergency guardianship would require court appearances, extensive documentation, and acceptance of legal obligations that could not be reversed if circumstances proved more challenging than anticipated. But the alternative of allowing Emma to enter county foster care during her mother's extended illness represented abandonment of a child who trusted me completely and had demonstrated remarkable progress under consistent care and protection. The prospect of Emma experiencing additional trauma through placement with strangers during her mother's medical crisis was unacceptable, regardless of the personal cost or uncertainty involved in formal guardianship proceedings. I spent the remainder of that sleepless night researching emergency guardianship procedures, while Emma slept peacefully in the nursery that had become her sanctuary during weeks of instability and change. The legal requirements were complex but manageable, demanding documentation of Emma's current placement, evidence of her thriving under my care, and testimony from medical professionals about Maria's condition and treatment timeline. The morning brought Emma's usual routine of breakfast, playtime, and preparation for activities that provided structure and security during circumstances. She was too young to understand but old enough to sense through adult emotional responses. Her cheerful babbling and affectionate gestures created sharp contrast with the magnitude of decisions I faced about her future and my capacity to provide appropriate long-term care. Linda Rodriguez arrived at my apartment within hours of my request for emergency consultation, bringing legal documents and professional guidance that would facilitate the guardianship process while ensuring compliance with regulations designed to protect children's interests during family crises. Her presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support during a period when uncertainty about Emma's future created anxiety that affected my ability to maintain the calm consistency she needed. Emergency guardianship is designed precisely for situations like Emma's, where a child's welfare depends on maintaining stable placement during a parent's extended medical treatment, Linda explained while reviewing documentation that would support my petition for legal authority over Emma's care. Your relationship with Emma and evidence of her developmental progress under your care provide strong foundation for court approval. The legal process would require testimony from Dr. Martinez about Maria's medical condition, documentation from St. Catherine's Family Services about Emma's placement history, and evidence of my capability to provide appropriate long-term care for a child with Emma's specific needs and background. Linda's assessment suggested that approval was likely given the circumstances and professional support for continued placement. But the guardianship petition would also trigger family court procedures that could expose Emma's situation to scrutiny from Marcus Walker and other relatives who opposed permanent custody arrangements. Their previous threats to challenge my involvement in Emma's care through legal action could complicate emergency proceedings and create additional stress during an already difficult period. Linda's advice emphasized the importance of proceeding with confidence and transparency about my motivations and capabilities, while maintaining focus on Emma's needs rather than family conflicts that were ultimately irrelevant to court decisions about her welfare. The legal system prioritized child protection over adult preferences, and Emma's documented thriving under my care would carry more weight than objections based on family dynamics or financial considerations. The afternoon brought a visit from Maria Santos, who had been granted temporary leave from intensive care to discuss guardianship arrangements and provide formal consent for continued placement of Emma in my home. Maria's physical appearance reflected the severity of her medical crisis, but her mental clarity and emotional strength demonstrated the resilience that had enabled her to advocate for Emma's welfare, despite overwhelming personal challenges. "I know that asking you to accept permanent responsibility for Emma is an enormous request," Maria said, her voice carrying gratitude and concern in equal measure. "But I also know that she needs someone who will love her unconditionally and protect her interests when I cannot do so myself." Maria's formal consent to emergency guardianship included her endorsement of my petition and her testimony about Emma's adjustment to placement in my home. Her perspective as Emma's biological mother would provide crucial support for legal proceedings, while demonstrating that guardianship arrangements served Emma's interests rather than adult preferences or convenience. The conversation with Maria also addressed long-term possibilities for co-parenting arrangements that would preserve her maternal rights, while providing Emma with enhanced stability and resources through continued placement in my home. These discussions required honesty about Maria's ongoing medical needs and my commitment to supporting her relationship with Emma, regardless of specific legal arrangements that might evolve over time. "Emma will always know that you are her first mother, and that your love for her motivated every decision we have made about her care," I assured Maria, recognizing that her greatest fear involved losing her central role in Emma's life through circumstances beyond her control. Maria's response revealed the depth of her understanding about Emma's needs and her appreciation for the relationship we had developed during weeks of intensive caregiving. Her blessing for formal guardianship carried emotional weight that strengthened my resolve to accept legal responsibilities, despite uncertainty about challenges that might arise during Emma's continued development. The emergency guardianship hearing took place in family court 3 days later, in a formal setting that emphasized the legal significance of decisions about Emma's future, while providing procedural protections for everyone involved in the proceedings. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided over testimony from medical professionals, social service providers, and family members who could address Emma's needs and my capability to meet them appropriately. Dr. Martinez provided comprehensive testimony about Maria's medical condition and treatment timeline, establishing the necessity for extended placement while preserving hope for Maria's eventual recovery and resumed parenting capability. Her professional assessment emphasized that Emma's continued placement in my home served her developmental needs while supporting Maria's medical treatment through reduced parenting stress. Linda Rodriguez testified about Emma's documented progress under my care, her adjustment to placement routines, and the professional support available through Street, Catherine's family services for ongoing guardianship arrangements. Her endorsement carried significant weight given her expertise in child welfare and her direct observation of Emma's thriving under consistent care and protection. Janet Walker's testimony provided family perspective that supported guardianship, while acknowledging the complexity of relationships involved in Emma's placement. Her description of Emma's integration into our family and her assessment of my parenting capabilities offered crucial validation from someone whose judgment the court would respect, and whose relationship to all parties created credibility for her observations. Marcus Walker's appearance at the hearing represented the organized opposition I had anticipated, but his testimony focused on procedural concerns about notification and consultation rather than substantive objections to my capability or commitment to Emma's welfare. His questions about financial resources and long-term planning revealed continuing skepticism about permanent arrangements, but they did not present evidence that would undermine court approval of emergency guardianship. My own testimony provided opportunity to articulate my understanding of Emma's needs, my commitment to her ongoing development, and my plans for maintaining her relationship with Maria throughout the guardianship period. The court's questions focused on practical matters regarding child care arrangements, financial resources, and support systems that would ensure Emma's continued thriving under formal guardianship. Judge Hernandez's decision granted emergency guardianship with provisions for regular review of Emma's placement and Maria's medical progress. The ruling emphasized that guardianship served Emma's immediate needs while preserving possibilities for modified arrangements as circumstances evolved over time. The court's approval provided legal authority for Emma's continued care, while acknowledging the complexity of relationships and the importance of maintaining her connection to her biological mother. The immediate aftermath of the court hearing brought both relief and recognition of the magnitude of responsibilities I had formally accepted. Emma's legal placement in my home was now secure regardless of family opposition or unexpected complications. But the guardianship also created obligations that extended far beyond temporary crisis management to permanent commitment to her welfare and development. Emma's response to the changes in her legal status was, predictably, focused on immediate concerns about routine and attention rather than abstract concepts about guardianship and court proceedings. Her continued thriving under consistent care demonstrated that stability and love mattered more than legal technicalities. But the formal arrangements provided security that would protect her interests if future crises arose. The evening following the court hearing provided opportunity for reflection about the transformation that had occurred in my life since discovering Emma's existence in David's car. The woman who had been focused entirely on processing grief and settling estate obligations had become someone whose primary identity centered on advocating for a vulnerable child's needs and protection. The change felt both dramatic and completely natural, as if caring for Emma had awakened capabilities that had been waiting for appropriate circumstances to develop and flourish. The legal guardianship represented formal recognition of relationships and commitments that had already become central to my understanding of purpose and responsibility. Maria's phone call that evening provided confirmation that the guardianship arrangements served her interests as well as Emma's, by ensuring continued stability during her extended treatment while preserving her parental rights and maintaining her connection to Emma's daily life. Her gratitude for my commitment created emotional bonds that extended the concept of family beyond traditional biological relationships to include shared dedication to a child's welfare. Emma is fortunate to have two mothers who love her completely and prioritize her needs over everything else, Maria said, articulating the foundation for successful co-parenting that would define Emma's upbringing, regardless of specific legal arrangements that might evolve over time. The conversation with Maria also addressed practical arrangements for maintaining Emma's connection to her biological mother during the extended treatment period. Regular video calls, hospital visits when medically appropriate, and documentation of Emma's developmental progress would preserve their relationship while supporting Maria's recovery through continued involvement in her daughter's life. Janet Walker's visit later that evening provided family perspective on the guardianship decision and its implications for Emma's integration into the Walker family, despite Marcus's continued opposition to permanent arrangements. Janet's support for Emma's placement and her commitment to maintaining grandmotherly relationships demonstrated that family connections could transcend legal technicalities and biological relationships when built on genuine affection and shared values. David would be proud of the mother you have become to Emma and the strength you have shown in protecting her interests despite family pressure, Janet observed, providing validation that connected my current choices to values that David and I had shared during our marriage. The recognition that David would have supported my guardianship decision provided emotional closure to questions about whether my commitment to Emma honored or betrayed the marriage we had built together. Emma's presence in my life represented continuation of David's values and work rather than replacement of our relationship, and caring for her created connections to his memory that were more meaningful than preserving his possessions or maintaining previous routines. As I prepared for sleep on the first night of formal guardianship, Emma's peaceful breathing from the nursery provided soundtrack for contemplation about the future we would build together. The legal proceedings had concluded, but the real work of parenting and advocacy was just beginning, requiring sustained commitment to Emma's development and protection throughout her childhood and beyond. The point of no return had been crossed not during the court hearing, but during the moment when I first decided that Emma's welfare mattered more than family approval or personal convenience. The formal guardianship simply provided legal framework for commitments that had already become central to my identity and purpose, creating security that would protect Emma's interests while allowing both of us to focus on the daily work of building a life together that honored the love that had brought us to this extraordinary arrangement. The reality of formal guardianship introduced complexities that temporary placement had not required, transforming my daily existence into a carefully orchestrated balance between professional responsibilities, parenting obligations, and advocacy work that extended far beyond Emma's immediate needs. The legal authority to make decisions about her welfare came with heightened visibility within systems designed to monitor child placement outcomes, creating accountability structures that demanded documentation and professional competency I was still developing through practical experience. Margaret Chen's response to my request for permanent flexible work arrangements revealed institutional limitations that had not been apparent during temporary crisis management. The Riverside Community Foundation had accommodated my modified schedule during Emma's initial placement, but formal guardianship created long-term obligations that required comprehensive restructuring of my role and responsibilities within the organization. We support employees facing family challenges, but we need to understand how permanent guardianship will affect your capacity to fulfill the donor relations requirements that are central to your position, Margaret explained during our scheduled review meeting. Major donors expect consistent access and relationship continuity that may be difficult to maintain while managing full-time parenting responsibilities. The conversation forced me to articulate priorities that had evolved during weeks of intensive caregiving, recognizing that Emma's needs had become more important than career advancement or institutional expectations. My work at the foundation remained meaningful, but it could no longer serve as my primary source of identity and purpose when a vulnerable child depended on my consistent presence and advocacy. I am committed to maintaining donor relationships and supporting the foundation's mission, but Emma's welfare must take precedence when conflicts arise between professional obligations and parenting responsibilities, I replied, acknowledging that this prioritization might limit my advancement opportunities while ensuring transparency about my availability and focus. Margaret's response revealed understanding tempered by organizational concerns about productivity and client service that would affect my colleagues if my reduced capacity required them to assume additional responsibilities. The conversation concluded with agreement to restructure my position toward part-time status, with modified responsibilities that emphasized tasks compatible with flexible scheduling and home-based work. The professional adjustments represented significant financial sacrifice, reducing my income by approximately 40% while increasing expenses related to Emma's care, medical needs, and developmental activities. The mathematics of single parenting on reduced income created challenges that required creative solutions and careful resource management, but the financial pressure felt manageable compared to the satisfaction of providing Emma with stability and nurturing attention. Emma's developmental progress during the weeks following formal guardianship demonstrated the benefits of consistent care and reduced disruption to her daily routines. Her vocabulary expanded rapidly, incorporating new words and phrases that reflected growing comfort with expressing her needs and preferences. Her play became more creative and sustained, indicating cognitive development that thrived under conditions of security and responsive adult attention. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the pediatric developmental specialist who conducted Emma's required guardianship evaluation, documented improvements that exceeded expectations for children who had experienced early placement disruption and parental illness. Her assessment emphasized Emma's emotional resilience and secure attachment patterns that indicated successful adaptation to guardianship arrangements. Emma demonstrates remarkable recovery from early trauma and separation anxiety, Dr. Reeves observed during her comprehensive evaluation. Her developmental milestones are appropriate for her age, and her social engagement suggests that she feels genuinely secure in her current placement. The consistency of care and emotional responsiveness she receives have created optimal conditions for continued healthy development. The professional validation strengthened my confidence in parenting approaches that had developed through intuition and careful observation of Emma's responses to different strategies for meeting her needs. The formal endorsement from a specialist in child development also provided documentation that would support ongoing guardianship review processes and potential future challenges from family members who continued to question the permanence of Emma's placement. Emma's integration into community activities revealed both the joys and complexities of single parenting a toddler whose background differed from typical family structures. Enrollment in a developmental playgroup at the local community center required detailed explanation of guardianship arrangements and medical history that highlighted Emma's unique circumstances while ensuring she received appropriate care and attention. The other parents in the playgroup demonstrated varying levels of comfort with Emma's placement situation, ranging from enthusiastic support for my commitment to a child in need to subtle questions about the appropriateness of forming deep attachments to children who might eventually return to biological parents. These interactions provided my first sustained experience with social judgment about non-traditional family arrangements and the assumptions people made about motivations for caring for children without biological connections. Sarah Martinez, another single mother in the playgroup whose 3-year-old daughter quickly befriended Emma, became an unexpected source of practical advice and emotional support during the adjustment period. Sarah's experience as a divorced parent navigating community activities and social services provided insights that helped me anticipate challenges while building confidence in my capacity to advocate effectively for Emma's interests. "The most important thing is Emma's obvious happiness and security with you," Sarah observed after watching our interaction during several playgroup sessions. "Children cannot fake the kind of attachment and trust Emma demonstrates, and anyone who questions your relationship with her is revealing their own limitations rather than legitimate concerns about her welfare." Quote, "The friendship with Sarah evolved into regular social interaction that provided Emma with peer relationships while giving me adult companionship with someone who understood the complexities of single parenting and community navigation. Our weekly coffee meetings while the children played became essential opportunities for processing challenges and celebrating achievements that might otherwise have gone unrecognized." Emma's relationship with Maria Santos continued to develop through structured visits that balanced her need for maternal connection with the stability requirements of her placement in my home. Maria's medical condition had stabilized sufficiently to allow supervised visits at the hospital family center, where Emma could spend several hours each week with her biological mother, while maintaining the security of returning to familiar routines. These visits created complex emotions for both Maria and me as we navigated the unusual dynamics of shared motherhood during circumstances neither of us had anticipated or planned. Emma's obvious love for both of us required careful coordination to ensure that her loyalty was not divided by competing claims for her primary affection and attention. "Emma needs to know that loving both of us is not only acceptable but desirable," Maria explained during one of our coordination meetings. "She should never feel that choosing one relationship requires diminishing the other, and our success as co-parents depends on supporting her connections to both families." Maria's wisdom about Emma's emotional needs reflected maturity and selflessness that made our unusual arrangement possible, despite potential complications from jealousy or territorial feelings about parental authority. Her commitment to Emma's welfare over her own preferences for exclusive maternal relationships created foundation for collaborative parenting that served Emma's interests while preserving important connections. The hospital visits also provided opportunities for Maria and me to discuss Emma's development, coordinate medical care decisions, and plan for potential future arrangements as Maria's health improved and her capacity for independent parenting increased. These conversations required delicate balance between honesty about challenges and hope for positive outcomes that served everyone's long-term interests. Emma's second birthday celebration became an opportunity to demonstrate the extended family network that had developed around her care and protection. The party took place at Janet Walker's house with attendance from Maria Santos, Dr. Martinez, Linda Rodriguez, Sarah Martinez and her daughter, and several relatives who had overcome initial resistance to Emma's permanent placement. The gathering represented validation of Emma's secure place within multiple communities of care and the success of arrangements that had seemed impossible when I first discovered her existence in David's car. Her obvious joy in the attention and affection from adults who had committed to her welfare provided evidence that non-traditional family structures could create rich, supportive environments for child development. Marcus Walker's absence from the celebration reflected continuing family tensions about Emma's permanent placement, but the participation of other relatives demonstrated that opposition was not universal, and that Emma's integration into the Walker family extended beyond legal formalities to genuine emotional connections. Emma has brought our family together in ways that honor David's memory while creating new relationships that enrich all of our lives, Janet observed while watching Emma open presents with characteristic toddler enthusiasm. She represents the best of David's values and the continuation of his commitment to protecting vulnerable children. The birthday celebration also marked Maria's first extended visit outside the hospital environment since her medical crisis had begun. Her participation in Emma's special day represented significant progress in her recovery, while demonstrating her continued central role in Emma's life, despite guardianship arrangements that had formalized my legal authority over daily care decisions. The success of the birthday party created momentum for planning additional family activities that would integrate Emma's two families while providing her with diverse relationships and experiences. These plans required ongoing coordination between Maria and me, but they also represented hope for sustainable co-parenting arrangements that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining Emma's security and development. Emma's enrollment in an early childhood development program marked another milestone in her integration into community structures and my evolution as an advocate for her educational needs. The application process required comprehensive documentation of her medical history, developmental assessments, and guardianship arrangements that highlighted the complexity of her background while ensuring appropriate support services. The program director, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, demonstrated exceptional understanding of Emma's unique circumstances and the specific support strategies that would facilitate her continued emotional and cognitive development. Her assessment emphasized Emma's strengths and resilience while identifying areas where additional attention might prevent future challenges. Emma demonstrates remarkable adaptability and social engagement for a child who has experienced early disruption, Dr. Walsh observed during the intake evaluation. Her secure attachment to her guardian and her comfort with new environments suggest that she will thrive in structured educational settings that provide appropriate challenge and support. The educational placement represented my first major decision as Emma's guardian that would affect her long-term development and social integration. The choice required research into various programs, consideration of financial implications, and coordination with Maria about preferences and priorities for Emma's early learning experiences. The decision-making process revealed how thoroughly my identity had transformed, from someone focused primarily on personal and professional advancement, to someone whose primary concerns centered on creating optimal conditions for a child's growth and development. The shift felt completely natural, while representing fundamental changes in priorities, relationships, and daily focus that had occurred gradually through months of intensive caregiving. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.